On October 12, 1977, the Northern Forestry Centre in Edmonton, Canada, also known as NoFC, received a phone call from a 45-year-old resident in the small city of Kugaaruk named Jimmy Caskey. He told the person who answered that a man by the name of Richard Karr moments ago had stopped in front of his house, hunched over a dog sled, clinging to life. Jimmy knew something wasn't right, as everyone knows everyone in Kugaaruk, but he didn't know this man or how he even arrived without going through the city's only airport, which he would have known if he had. Richard told him he might not survive, then said, "Call NoFC in Edmonton now. Tell them Carr found Lab 18. Send the men immediately." He also marked on a map for Jimmy where Lab 18 was, in case he died, so he could pass it on to the men who were supposedly coming. Over the next several days, Richard's condition surprisingly improved, looking like he would pull out of it. 2 days after he'd made the call, 3 unknown men arrived by private jet at Kugaaruk Airport. They immediately went to Jimmy's house where Richard was staying. They asked him to leave while they spoke to Richard, so he went down to the local coffee shop. An hour later, one of the men came in, went up to Jimmy, whispering something in his ear. Jimmy's best friend, who was sitting next to him, said his face turned cold as he got up and left without saying anything. 7 days went by where no one saw him, which was strange but not unheard of in those parts. One day, out of the blue, he showed back up at the coffee shop, peering through the shop's glass window, looking like he'd been raked through hell. He walked in with his head hanging low as he slowly walked over to a booth and sat down. Someone immediately went and fetched his best friend, who dropped everything and quickly came. This is a conversation they had. His friend asked not to be named. Jimmy's friend: "Where the hell have you been, man? We almost sent out a search party to find your ass. You've never been gone for 7 days straight. Where are the 3 men who came here?" "Last I checked, which was yesterday, Richard is still at your house but won't talk to anyone. Says he's waiting for you guys to return." There was a long pause before Jimmy spoke, telling his friend everything that had taken place. "When I found Carr outside my house and he told me to call NoFC, I figured he was just losing his mind from hypothermia and being so close to death. I thought for sure they'd think I was crazy and hang up, but they put me on hold for a while before a man came on asking, 'Is Richard Karr still alive? What did he tell you?' I then told the man exactly what I already had and said that's all he's told me so far." Before hanging up, the man said, "Try keeping him alive until the men show up, which should be no more than a few days." Shortly after that, Carr began telling me a disturbing story but suddenly stopped and wouldn't utter another word. I wasn't sure if I believed what he told me, but I also didn't think the Forestry Centre would check out, but it did. Either way, something strange was going on, with a lot of unanswered questions. When they arrived at my place, they introduced themselves by first name only: Glenn, the leader, who looked to be in his mid-30s, as did the other men, John and Jeremiah. Then, like I told you before, they asked to speak with him alone, so I came down here, and you and I talked until John came in to fetch me. When you saw him whisper in my ear, he said I was to go help them find this Lab 18 card found, and I'd be well compensated, but didn't say how much. I wanted to say no, but got the feeling I'd be left with no choice, or the alternative would be grave, so I hesitantly agreed. We still had the dogs and sled Carr came in on, plus we had mine, so it would work with 2 men to a team. Carr still wasn't out of the woods yet, so they told him to stay at my place until we came back. Our plan was to leave the following morning. As I was loading up the sleds, they brought out 3 black cases, about the size of a medium suitcase, which caught me off guard, being I hadn't noticed before. I figured they'd stashed them outside somewhere. They were heavy, which made me want to ask what the hell was in them, because the dogs were going to get a good workout, and as you know, there are weight limits. Instead, I just bit my tongue. I had my suspicions on what was in them, though, based on what little information Carr had told me, and at the time I figured the less they thought I knew, the better. Wiser to play the dumb country boy for the time being. I wasn't sure if Carr told them what he'd started telling me, or if he even remembered, given the state he was in. The place we were headed was quite a ways past Lake Barrow, somewhere I'd never ventured and had no idea how long it would take by sled. The entire time I was loading up the sleds and readying the dogs, the 3 of them seemed to be shrouded in secrecy. whispering to one another or speaking low enough I couldn't hear them. I paid no mind to it and carried on like I wasn't paying attention. Right before we were about to leave, I gave them a dose of reality, letting them know how dangerous what we were about to embark on was. I also gave them a crash course on how to use dog sleds, being this was their first time. Before leaving and yelling "hike" to the dogs, I turned, looked back at my house, and could see Karr staring at us from my living room window. The thought entered my mind, what the hell am I doing? Am I ever going to see this place again? I turned back and shouted "hike" at the dogs as they excitedly took off. It had been so long since they'd been ran, I imagined they were anxious to go. Lucky for us, the weather was clear. The dogs weren't in the best shape, and the last thing we needed was more snow. We'd been going for a few hours when I figured it was time to give the dogs a rest and see how the men were doing. It wasn't hard to see the men were uncomfortable and extremely cold, not being used to the frigid temps. Whatever they were seeking out there must be very important, I thought. After talking to them for a bit and letting the dogs catch their breath, we started up again. I at least wanted to make it to the north end of Lake Barrow before nightfall because of the good places to camp that would hide us from the elements. We slogged on for several more hours when I could tell the dogs were too exhausted to continue, so we stopped for the night. The lake wasn't much further, but the last thing I wanted was to wear the dogs out on the first day. Having to make the trip home on foot would be dangerous, if not deadly. "Are we stopping here for the night?" asked Glenn. "Yes. I planned on trying to make it to a specific spot, but the dogs are beyond exhausted, and they're our lifeline. Without them, we're in a world of hurt," I replied. "Understood," he responded as he lent his hand to Jeremiah, helping him up from the sled. John was sitting on my sled as I went and helped him up. "Damn, it's cold as hell up here," he said as he stepped off the sled. "Just wait until night settles in. We need to get camp set up and get our asses in the tents before the temp really drops," I responded. Then, as if it was an unspoken order and without hesitation, the men began setting up camp with such precision and speed unlike I'd ever seen. "These gents have got to be military," I thought to myself as I watched them with keen interest. When I saw them remove some IRPs from their packs for dinner, it pretty much confirmed to me they were. They even set up my tent as I tended to the dogs before retiring for the night. Before falling asleep, they quietly talked for a while, and the only thing I was able to make out was, "We're going to have to tell him at some point." My mind went back to what Karr began telling me before he clammed up, going silent. "We found it. It was worse than I expected. The others, they..." That's when he glared me in the eyes and stopped. I almost blurted out, "Found what?" But he turned his head away from me, so I left it alone. Again, I wasn't sure if he was just talking nonsense or what. As soon as it got light enough, we had a quick breakfast, broke down camp, then continued on. An hour later, we reached the spot I'd wanted to camp the previous night. I glanced over, remembering how many times I'd camped there in the past. I figured we still had another full day and then some before we reached the place Karr marked on the map. I called it a night when we made it past Lake Barrow and a bit to a spot with a cliff behind us and giant boulders surrounding us. Again, I wasn't going to push the dogs any harder than I had to. Even though they always seemed to be in an unspoken rush, I think they respected my decisions and opinions, which was wise of them, being one mistake could mean death out here, as you know. After eating dinner, it wasn't long before I fell asleep, but was awakened by Jeremiah at my tent saying, "Jimmy, Glenn would like a word with you." It took a minute to realize I wasn't dreaming before I replied, "All right, I'll be right there." I quickly sat up, got my boots and coat on, then went over to their tent. Inside, they were sitting on top of their sleeping bags, looking like they were having a serious discussion. I took notice of their weapons, which I'd suspected were in the black cases. "Sit down, Jimmy," said Glenn. I nodded my head as I sat down next to John. "I knew at some point we were going to have to tell you what Lab 18 is and why we were out here risking our lives like this in this godforsaken cold," he said. "Of course I've been wondering," I replied. "Lab 18 is probably not what you think it is. It's not a lab, a place for scientists. It's a thing. It stands for Living Apparition Being. They're called that because we don't quite know what they are. We do know we can kill them, though," he said. It took me a minute to fully grasp what he just said before I asked, "You're telling me there's some type of living apparition out there?" Like flesh and blood? That's exactly what I'm telling you, he replied. What do they look like? What the hell is it exactly? I asked. That we don't know. Reports and photos have shown us they can look like a man, woman, child, or an unimaginable beast. Is it something we need to be really worried about? I asked. He paused before saying, one night 10 years ago, several miles from the small city of Coastal Mexico, 6 specially trained Mexican soldiers were dispatched to find and kill Lab 13. They were supposedly some of the best that had ever been trained for this. After completing a mission, as soon as we're able to, we're supposed to call in and report the outcome. Days went by though, and there was no word from them. Another team from Mexico City was then dispatched to find them. When they arrived at the spot where Lab 13 was supposed to be, all they found were the soldiers' bare bones in a small pond. No one ever found out if Lab 13 was killed or what happened to it. Sometimes they're never found. They simply vanish before a team arrives, leaving behind only their unimaginable carnage. Why Lab 18? What does the 18 stand for? I asked. It's the 18th one that's been found on the planet since our government started a coordinated effort on the matter and started keeping track 25 years ago, he replied. How do you find these things, these labs? I asked. That we don't know for sure. It's actually a mystery. Someone at our office or a similar office to ours in another country receives a phone call from an unknown person giving an exact location or an area where a lab is. We're then immediately dispatched to take care of it. They're always in the middle of nowhere at first, away from civilization, always near a water source. Then at any given moment, they make their way towards people. No one ever knows when or where a lab will show up until the phone call comes. Richard Karr's team was sent here over 6 days ago, bypassing the city altogether to take care of Lab 18 when we received the phone call from you saying he was alive in your house. This was Karr's first time out as well, and his team was slaughtered, he replied. Are you his backup team? I asked. Yes, if you could call us that. We've been training for this for several years, but this is our first time in the field, actually going after one. Why tell me all this? I asked. This may be my job, but I'm still a man with principles, and it's not right leading you into this without knowing what you're getting into. We know we're close based on what you told us, and we're also giving you the chance to leave once we know exactly where to go, he replied. I said nothing for a while, absorbing everything I'd been told when I said, I appreciate you telling me, but you men will die out here simply from the elements if you don't have me, and my principles won't let me do that either. I think we're only about an hour away from the spot on the map, so we'll wake up when it's light out and a little warmer before leaving. It'll give the dogs more rest as well. This October has been very unusual. It's lighter for much longer periods of time, and usually we're getting hammered with more snow. Still cold as hell though, colder than usual come to think of it. Never seen anything like it in all my years, I said as I stood up and left. My mind was spinning as I got in my sleeping bag. Part of me wanted to believe he was full of shit, but deep down I knew he was telling the truth. After I shut my mind off and fell asleep, I was awakened hours later to the sound of one of the dogs whining, most likely hungry or getting restless, I thought. I stuck my head out and could see the men were already up and breaking down their tent. I was surprised they didn't wake me, as I'm a very light sleeper, which means they must have been extremely quiet. I went back inside and started gathering my things when I heard Jeremiah shout out, Glenn, behind you! John, hurry, toss me the Uzi now! The repeated sound of machine gun fire started going off as I hit the ground, laying as flat as I could for fear I'd get hit. Not long after, a second machine gun joined in, sounding to me like the world was coming to an end. Then without warning, it all stopped as my ears continued ringing. To be continued. Part 2, coming Sunday, January 19th at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.